Hello and welcome to, this is part 2 of Awakening to the Magic of Ancient Egypt. If you have not watched part 1, I would suggest that you go back and watch it to know where we're up to. My name is Frances Billinghurst. I'm the creatrix of the Mystical Soul Academy. And as I mentioned in part 1, ancient Egypt has long been an interest of mine. And when I eventually got to ancient Egypt, I sort of basically came away with more questions than answers. So this video is part of my ponderings, trying to work things out. So I'm just going to share my screen so we can continue on with our journey. So we have sort of looked at the fact that in ancient Egypt, they viewed magic, religion, science, medicine, all being connected. Magic to them, and in particular their Netta, their god, Heka, who was their Netta of magic, was also connected in with this energy, this power that ran through the whole cosmos itself. So Heka not only imbued the words with magic, he was also connected with this universal energy and power. And he himself was considered to be the son of the ram-headed god Hamun, and also Menet. Now, Menet is possibly a Nubian lion goddess of war from the kingdom of Kush. And they form part of the Trinity that was honored and worshipped at Esna in southern Egypt, which is where Nubia borders onto Egypt. And this means that not only was Heka a Netta god of magic, he was also the god, the Netta of the power of magic, the first work. And he was also known as the Lord of the Khu, of the spirits. Often Heka accompanies and protects Ra, the sun Netta, riding on Ra's solar bark as it descended into the netherworld, the Duat. He was also one of the defenders of Osiris in the netherworld, as well as being involved with the defeat of Epi, better known by the Greek as Apophis, the so-called evil god or demon, whether this is a modern perception, we don't know, who was depicted as a great snake. Epic was seen also as pure embodiment of chaos, destruction, deep darkness, and he was considered as such to be the main enemy of not only the Neteru, but also the pharaohs. What's also interesting, as I mentioned in the last section, is that snakes in ancient Egypt, like how they are seen throughout Eastern philosophy, are connected with life force energy. Also, ancient Egyptian belief was everything was cyclic. And this is something we also see in Eastern philosophy when they talk about, especially within Hindu or Sanskrit teaching, when they talk about the yugas, the stages, the cycles of life, or the great procession, the great wheel. We are depending on teachings either in or coming out of what's known as Kali Yuga, which is a time of darkness, of great suffering, and we're becoming more enlightened into the lighter phases. Now, whether we're viewing this physically, emotionally, energetically, consciously, it's up to the individual to interpret. But in order to move through into the light, we have to go through the stage of chaos. And that is epi. In some teachings too, it's also Set of the Ennead. Set has connected him with the desert, and at Edfu, he is seen on the walls, sort of, I think he's in a pig or hippopotamus depiction. And he is not seen, he might be seen as evil, but again, the evil is not what we would perceive as evil from our sort of Christian influenced society. That's something that needs to be getting rid of. It was something that we needed to sort of like almost a bit like shadow work we need to embrace, because it might make us feel uncomfortable. It then enabled us to move through what was no longer working, to shed what is no longer in alignment, and move from darkness, the heaviness, into light. And again, this is what Heka did. He sort of protected the Pharaoh, protected the Neteru from being totally engulfed in the darkness. And this is what Heka is considered to be connected in with as well, because he was the natural order of things, whose role was maintaining that order. In other words, Heka was the force that kept the universe moving. In ancient Egyptian cosmology, before the world itself was shaped into being, its creator conceived in its heart the force of Heka, which was both a creative logos as well as the source of energy that was fundamental to the whole cosmos. And in Richard's interpretation of the coffin text, in spell 261, we find Heka himself addressing all the other Neteru, so declaring his origins and his powers. O noble ones who are before the all, behold, I have come before you. Respect me in accordance with what you know. I am he whom the unique Lord made before duality came into being in this land, by his sending forth his unique eye when he existed alone, by the going forth from his mouth when his myriads of spirits were the protection of his companions, when he spoke with Kefri, with him, that he might be more powerful than he, when he put who upon his mouth. I am indeed the son of the all, who was born before his mother yet existed. I am the protection of that which the unique Lord has ordained. I am he who caused the Ennead to live. The standard is high, the gods is endowed in the accordance with the command of her who bore a tongue. I have kept silence. I have bowed down. I have seated myself, O balls of heaven, in my great dignity as Lord of Kas, heir of Ra-Utum. I have come so that I may take possession of my throne, so that I may assume my dignity. For to me belonged the universe before you gods had yet come into being. Descend. You have come afterwards. I am Heka. And it's quite interesting because he does mention an aspect of who are going to discuss a little bit later. He mentions Caffrey, the scarab beetle, the beginning of the sun, as the sun begins to rise up. And he's also, though he's making this announcement, it's done with humility and reverence. There is other sources, in particular like Wise, who state that it is Amun-Ra who created the Neteru through the act of speech. Other words described as breath, whereby the universe was brought forth, breathed to existence. And the oldest aspect of the sun, which is Ra, is believed to have been generated by Heka, or magic. But regardless of interpretation, one thing that can be agreed upon is that it all came from magic. The ancient Egyptians perceived it as the underlying source that flowed through the universe. In a way, much like how we use the word or the concept of consciousness. And I guess it really depends on how we describe things and how open we are to it basically being the same thing, or at least similar. At the end of the day, magic, consciousness, even energy, is ultimately the foundational stones of the universe, of how and the why of the ways things are. And it can be somewhat difficult to try or to truly understand, let alone believe in this perspective of magic, especially in our modern world, due to our separation that we have between magic, science, and religion. As I mentioned earlier, I have a very logical mind. I personally believe in science, yet I also believe that there are things beyond science that possibly cannot and may never be able to be explained. Going back to Max Planck's quote of the mystery, because we are the mystery. And this is because these things really underpin science. And what underpins science is magic. But circling back to this concept about the words of power, there's another spell entitled How to Become the God or Netta Heka that can be found where the magical process endorsed by Heka emphasizes the power of images, words, and breath. And when these three things occur, Heka is then set in motion and channeled in order to become manifest. Almost like how in modern words people want to manifest these days. But to the ancient Egyptians, it had three parts to it: images, words, and breath. Magic was seen as an act of creation. It was used for protection, as a weapon against evil. However, it was also connected in to doing what the user wanted it to do. It was a tool, a divine tool. And therefore it could be used in cursing and also attacking one's enemies. And from what's been discovered, there's been no evidence in the court cases that have come to light of being found that sort of detail the use of magic as being perceived as illegal. Say for one instance, and that was when the user attempted to use magic against the pharaoh. This in itself indicated that the ancient Egyptians believed in magic, that it worked. And that was very much part of their lives. Unlike what we saw throughout Europe and the colonies back in the late Middle Ages, really from the 16th century and 17th century, though it started before there, where there was this great fear magic because people saw it separate. They didn't see it as part of their religion. It was perceived as religion, but it was connected in with sorcery and the devil. The ancient Egyptians had a different perspective. They all saw it as part of their everyday life. And it's interesting to note that nowhere can there be found any depiction of their being as what we would describe as white or sort of good versus black or evil, bad magic, what we're familiar with today, such as sort of miracles, the white magic being bestowed upon the practitioner by the netters or the gods, as opposed to magic originating from demonology. To the ancient Egyptians, magic was simply magic. There was both harmful as well as beneficial spells. They were all sourced from Heka without any subdivision as to their worthiness. Added to this, as I've mentioned, the ancient Egyptian concept of magic cannot really be compared to how we determine religion today, largely because it was perceived as a force that animated religion, life itself. In ancient Egypt, magic was not immoral. It was rather amoral, meaning totally unconcerned with rightness or wrongness of anything. Magic was not an activity, a human endeavor. It was not something to judge or be judged by. It was perceived as a perennial force that animates life itself. The performing of a magical spell becomes an act of channeling whereby occult hidden power gets harnessed into the shape of the chosen physical result, which needs to be manifested. Like weaving your own reality by the means of this very fabric. Something to consider. And there were 3 neteru that were connected to this process. We've been looking at Heka, and I've very briefly mentioned who, but there was also a third, seer. Seer was the personification of divine knowledge or omniscience, which was necessary in order to understand the truth. He represented either the mind of the neteru or the heart, which was considered the seat of emotion, of thoughts and character. It was the heart that was weighed upon the scales of my art when a person died. Then there was who, as we'll see here, is represented with the tongue as his headdress. He was the personification of divine utterance, the authority of the spoken word. And as we've been discussing, Heka, the netter of magic, medicine, and the primordial force of the universe, the personification of divine magical power, which empowered life and sustained my art. And together, seer represented the intellect, who represented the word of the creator, whether it was Ptah or Atum, which brought thought into reality, and Heka was the underlying force that gave them power. And along with Ra, the sun god, or the sun netta, they rode on the solar bark across the sky in order to create and sustain all life. Having travelled through the netherworld each night and making it past the dangers with Heka at the front, the solar bark would then rise again at sunrise to signify that the world was being created anew. And the sun at that stage is Kefri, the scarab beetle, who we see here also on the bark. But again, returning to the power of words. Ancient Egyptian magic was defined by three characteristics: speech, property, and right. An example of speech, saying the right words, these aspects are connected in a way to Tahuti, Thoth, the ibis-headed netta of writing, who was considered to be excellent to magic in his capacity as Lord of the Hieroglyphs. Similarly, Heka may be directly identified with the spoken word, and spells are particularly labelled as God's words, according to Rita. To the ancient Egyptians, magic was imbued from the mouth. The words are a spark of magic. It is important to say the words. Words are very important. Be careful what you are talking about, what's coming out of your mouth. There can be examples of this found within the book Come Forth by Day or the Book of the Dead, or sort of more familiar with it being called, as well as other places. And what you see on the screen are just some examples where the mouth is connected in with the power of the words. May Atum repel you, Pet, with the spells of their mouths when you hear my magic. It has swallowed you by means of the magic of their mouth. Those in his bark destroy you in his bark with the spells of their utterances, with the magic in their bones. I have spoken by means of your spell. I have recited by means of your magic. I have spoken by means of your statement. I have made spells by means of your spells. I have enchanted by means of your words, which you have created by means of this magic which is in your mouth. All being spoken. Words are power. They let the user describe, define things. It is this act of naming, the act of using words, that is an act of power. And this includes prophecies, oracles, and, of course, spells. All of these things were considered to be magic to the ancient Egyptians. And this naming of things, one of the myths in relation to Set or Isis, how she got her magical power, was through her discovering or encouraging, blackmailing Ra, can we say, into telling her his magical name. She had her scorpions fight him, and she would not cure him. She's also the goddess or netta of medicine, until Ra told her his magical name, which and then enabled her to speak his magical name and thus take his power. And this is something that can be seen or is followed through into practices of magic and the occult today, with the use or the original use of magical names, the power of naming something. Then there was the power of property. Magic is something a person possesses. For example, it is part of them. Therefore, it is their property. For the ancient Egyptians, magic required material objects such as plant material, stones, and the like. These natural products were considered to be parts of the neteru of the gods, or their bodily fluids, that they were of divine nature in and of themselves. And there's another quote. Horus cried, the water fell from his eye to the earth, and it grew. That is how dry myrrh came to be. Geb was sad on account of it. Blood fell from his nose to the ground, and it grew. That is how pines came to be, and resins came to be from their fluid. Then Shu and Tefnut cried exceedingly. Water from their eyes fell to the ground, and it grew. That is how incense came to be. Everything was created. Everything came from the life force. Everything came from magic. Everything came from the neteru, the gods. It was part of them. So when then the Egyptians took the incense, took the myrrh, took the pine resin, and burnt it as an offering back to the gods, they were imbuing themselves with the godlike power of the magic. Amulets were also a big part of ancient Egyptian magic. They mostly provided protection. Specific protection actually required specific stones and plants and incenses and offerings. And even when it came to medicine, there was always a spoken word part, the healing. This is the healing magic. Again, something that Heka was associated with. And then the final part was the power of the rites and ceremonies. Within the written texts and the hieroglyphs, there was also the performance or a performance of some kind of rite being taking place. The performer of the magic had to do something, regardless of whether it was binding or spitting or licking or blowing or swallowing, breaking, piercing. They had to do something. Ancient Egyptian magic required participation. There is also this connection with the act of encircling and this whole concept of circles that seems to be really popular. I talked in part one where the whole cosmos, life itself, was seen as circles within circles. And Risha noted that 13th dynasty texts, which was believed to derive from an original text from the 3rd dynasty, contained reference to a funeral procession circulating around the mastaba 4 times. Then he goes on to say that millennia later, Ptolemy IX was a recipient of a similar rite that circulated 4 times at Edfu. And this to Risha was testament of the longevity of ancient Egyptian rituals, that even the vessels associated with the rites often remained unchanged. And this circling happened within other ceremonies and other rituals, including the procession of the gods of the Nitaruds when the statues were taken out of the temples and paraded on feast days. They went round and round and round. There's also other spells found within the coffin texts and pyramid texts and other writings. In particular, are love spell, which is said to encircle the heart, whereas a curse encircled the individual in order to entrap them. And even today at Karnak, there is the statue of Khepri, the scarab beetle, out the back by the lake. And Khepri represents the sun as it rises. It's a symbol of rebirth from the afterworld or from the netherworlds, as we saw earlier. And it's considered sacred or traditional to walk 7 times around the statue of Khepri at Karnak in order to receive luck or love, fertility. And it's something that, mind you, tourists are seeing today. I don't know if it is, maybe it is really just sort of like a modern thing that the Egyptian guides are getting tourists to do, but people still do it. The circling around and around, still happening today. I would like to just end with this final quote from Rissa. It is in the rite and not the spell that the essence of Egyptian magic is to be sought. By virtue of its readily accessibility to the observation in contemporary cultures, such a ritual-orientated approach to magic has long been utilized in anthropology, so much so, in fact, that it has been necessary to defend the magical significance of a spell. In Egyptian studies, on contrary, the often laconic references to magical procedures within rubrics attached to verbose and mythologically innate spells have both subordinated the importance of these procedures and hindered their study. Indeed, Egyptian magical rites have been characterized as commonplace and their study dismissed as unrewarding. Nonetheless, as evidenced by the analysis of sufficient information survives to provide insights by no means trivial. Not is the supposed universality of Egyptian ritual grounds for disregard. Thus, although ritual encirclement is well documented in many cultures, the centrality of the rite in Egyptian magic is striking, and its uses and terminology uniquely Egyptian. In any case, it is the viewpoint of the Egyptian practitioner and not that of the comparative historian, which determines the significance of that rite. That the rite was of fundamental significance to the success of Egyptian magic's evidence, not merely by the presence of the signified directions of the rubrics and the depictions in literature, religious, medicinal, and even historical texts, but also by the very turns of phrase which the Egyptian employed it described magic. So it's very worthy. It does indicate a lot of points, though. First thing that really struck up for me is It was a person at the time who believed in the magic, where it was important of the magic. And this may not, as he said, relate to the comparative historian, may not be actually be seeing the importance of magic as how the ancient Egyptians saw it. Again, we're looking at something old from modern views. Magic itself, there was a universality. There was a whole point of it. It encompassed every stage of their life. It wasn't just taken out on Sundays for religion. It wasn't just manifesting because it's a full moon or a new moon. It was everywhere. And we need to sort of get out of our heads, our logical mindset, to truly understand the importance of magic within ancient Egyptian culture, because it was the underpinning. Magic also was very much in the doing, the rite, the physical actions, and not merely in the words itself. And with that, I'm going to end. I'm going to share. I hope you have found this interesting. I will put the link to Rita's book below. I do recommend having a look at it. And if you have any other queries, comments, suggestions, put them below. Blessings.